Good evening, everyone. So nice to see you. Hi, my name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor here at Brown in political science and international public affairs, and I currently serve as provost. And it's really a great pleasure and honor to be able to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Ken Miller. This talk is part of a larger series on reaffirming university values, a series that was started by the Office of the President and the Office of the Provost, but that engages lots of different departments and centers across the university. And the intention of this series was to basically remind us all as a community what we're all about and what we do best. And I would say that what we do best is to engage in and apply rigorous scholarship and to engage in thoughtful discussions and debates about some of society's most pressing challenges, and to do that work, both the research and the discussion of that research, of contested ideas, in a calm, respectful, and balanced way. Now, ultimately, what we're trying to do through our work, whether it's through our teaching or through our research, is to sort of do work that applies insightful research and reveals truth. Now, revealing truth seems both a very lofty and maybe even a very straightforward thing, but in practice, it can actually be quite challenging. Not just challenging in these days of supposedly, alternative facts and things like that, but also sometimes just the way that we talk about issues and not just the issues themselves has been something that we've struggled over here on campus, but not just in this campus. And I think it's really important for us to just remind ourselves that as a community, we have to come here, have these kinds of conversations, and learn from one another, even if at times we're learning from people whose original positions is different from the ones that we might have engaged in initially. This is especially important, it seems to me, in our current political climate, where we're very much a divided nation. And it's all the more important that we learn to speak across those divides and with one another so that we can engage in hopefully a common understanding, building bridges, and to pursue progress. Now, the recent election has certainly sort of highlighted these incredible divides that we have in our society, but it also has sort of challenged some of our basic values as a university. Values like the importance of science, the importance of scientific method, the importance of knowledge creation, etc. Now, science denial is not new. In fact, our speaker tonight has been on the forefront of defending science for a decade. And yet science denial appears to be increasingly widespread and gaining traction, even at some of the highest levels of our government. And just to give you some basic facts to support this, in 2015, there was a study on science and society conducted by the Pew Research Foundation. And I'll just give you some of the findings. So, for example, the survey found that 98% of scientists agree that humans have evolved over time, but only 65% of our country's citizens believe that. The survey demonstrated a 33-point gap between scientists and the general public when it comes to human activity's impact on climate change. And while 86% of scientists believe that vaccinations should be mandatory, their view is shared only by 68% of the public. And the study also found that respondents did not believe that scientists were in agreement about these different findings, whether about human activity and climate change and things like that, when in fact, more or less, they are in agreement. And I think this is important. So in the face of these findings, it seems to me very, very important for universities like our own here at Brown that we have to really redouble our efforts and undertake not only the day-to-day work of rigorous scholarship and teaching to create, to sort of advance knowledge, but we have to think more creatively of how do we translate what we do into the general discourse, into the general public, so that we can inform our fellow citizens. This is something that Ken Miller has been doing for decades. in public forums like this, but also in his other work as well. He's the author of many articles and several landmark works. One, Finding Darwin's God, A Scientist's Search for Common Ground Between God and Evolution, and another book, Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul. Basically addressing these kinds of issues that he'll talk about tonight and the ones that I prefaced earlier. He's been giving lectures around the country, writing, engaging in media, et cetera, and I think doing it extremely effectively. He's also, I think, quintessentially Brown. Ken is a 1970 graduate. He left to get his PhD at the University of Colorado and then to work at Harvard before returning here in 1980. And he's a highly celebrated teacher and a highly productive scholar. You can read a lot more about his biography here, so I won't rehearse it. But when I say he's quintessentially Brown, I mean not just because he's a fantastic teacher and a fantastic scholar, but he also sort of calls it like he sees it. And I have sometimes received some of that wisdom in my 20 months in this position. In the sense that, I mean, it's important that people actually speak up. They speak up candidly and honestly, and they give you feedback, because the only way that we can, at least that I know how to do a better job, is by getting honest feedback and trying to address this. Many of the things that we've been trying to do this year with this Reaffirming University Values were based on a conversation that I had with Ken and a few other colleagues, probably in November of 2015, trying to think about how we sort of promote this kind of climate and this kind of dialogue here on campus. So please join me in welcoming Ken Miller.
Thank you, Rich. Rich, thank you for that very generous introduction. I want to thank all of you for coming. It's a real honor to see so many of you here, so many friends, colleagues, students, and other people who might be interested in what I have to say. I thought I would start tonight with an origin story, which is how I got interested in the broad field of science denial. And this goes back to 1982. And as I put in the slide here, I'm just an innocent cell biologist puttering around in my lab. Very proud of the fact that I'm giving career advice here. Very proud of the fact that in the very week my department had to vote on whether or not I was going to be given tenure here, I had the cover story in Nature. That photograph is work from our lab, so if I had to give career advice to anybody, it's make sure your big science or nature paper comes out at the exact time when your department is trying to decide whether they want you around or not. But in any event, I'm working in the lab, and all of a sudden my phone rings, and it's actually a former student of mine who I had taught briefly at Harvard, a guy named Joe Levine. And Joe Levine had finished his PhD. He had gotten a job at Boston College, for which I congratulated him. And then he said, how would you like to write a high school biology textbook? And my quick response in my best New Jersey style was, what are you, nuts? Forget about it, go away, I'm coming up for a tenure decision, I don't want any part of this. And I just turned him down, and I said no for month after month after month. Bless his heart, he persisted. And eventually he convinced me that this is a project we might want to do. In a matter of almost no time, which is to say 8 years, that book came out. It became known as the Elephant Book. It was sort of an instant hit. And for any of you who might wonder whether or not the author of a textbook ever understands the reaction to books and so forth, I can tell you, I've been blessed with 2 daughters. My oldest daughter, Lauren, was actually my first editor, because she was 13 years old when I was writing this book, and this is intended for 9th and 10th graders. So every time I wrote a chapter, I gave it to Lauren. If Lauren understood it, I figured, cool, I got it. If Lauren says, Dad, I have no clue, then I rewrote it. Well, my younger daughter, Tracy, not so lucky. Tracy had to suffer the indignity of using her old man's textbook for freshman honors biology at Dighton-Rehoboth Regional High School in Massachusetts. And you might think that's a cool thing, and I guess it is. But I have to tell you, about a month into that school year, and I should preface this by saying that in Rehoboth, where I live, a lot of people at the time knew who I was, but not because of what I did for a living. They knew who I was because for like 7 or 8 years, I sort of was like the commissioner of the girls' softball program. I ran the spaghetti suppers to raise money. I trained our umpires. I used to coach one of our all-star teams, so they kind of knew me as a softball guy, but that was about it. So I'm driving up to the high school to pick Tracy up after field hockey practice, and there's a woman I know from softball who sees me there and sees my little pickup truck and gets very excited and flags me down. And her name is Bonnie Kelly, and I roll up next to the high school, roll down the window. I said, "Bonnie, what's up?" And she's very excited. She says, "Ken, you wrote the book they're using in the high school." And, you know, I got very proud, and I took a deep breath, and I puffed out my chest, and I said, "Yes, I did." And then she looked me straight in the eyes, and she said, "Funny thing is, you don't seem that smart." So I was never quite sure what to make of that. But in terms of the judgment of what an economist would call the marketplace, that judgment of our book was favorable. And Joe and I rewrote it a few years later, and then we rewrote it again. And then we rewrote it one more time after that. One of the great pleasures of being in science is science doesn't stand still. And in fact, we're about to bring out yet a new rewrite, a new edition of our textbook. So it's an extraordinary thing, and I always get a kick out of when my freshman students come into my office, they see one of these books on my bookshelves, and they say, "I think I had that in high school. What do you have it for?" And having a name like Miller, which just kind of fades into the background, they'd never made the connection, but eventually they do. Well, how did I get interested in science denial? Well, one of the editions of those books was widely adopted throughout the country, and actually in several other countries as well. And as it turns out, a number of citizens in Cobb County, Georgia, which is the second largest school district in Georgia, became very, very concerned about the treatment of evolution on our book. And they prevailed upon the Board of Education to slap a cigarette pack style warning label on our book. And this is the actual warning label. This textbook has material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. And I can tell you a lot of funny stories about this warning label. One of the favorite souvenirs I have in my office is actually a sheet of peel-off labels with the warning sticker on that a teacher I knew in Cobb County sent me because he had to put all these on the front of our book. Well, as it turns out, a number of citizens in the county who had children in the high school recognized this as an attempt to undermine a scientific theory for religious reasons. And 6 of them, led by Jeff Selman, a transplanted New Yorker who lives in the Atlanta area, very courageously sued the Board of Education. I had been down at Georgia State giving a scientific seminar right after this suit was filed, and Jeff came up to me, introduced himself, and said, "Would you testify when we go to trial?" I said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So in November 2004, I flew down to Atlanta. I was a witness in the trial. Trial lasted for 4 or 5 days in federal court, and lo and behold, we won. I was very happy about that. But because I'd been in the trial, on the day that the Associated Press wrote up the story, my name was in the first line of a news report that was reprinted in about 1,000 newspapers. You have no idea what my email inbox looked like the next morning. Many people suggesting where I would spend eternity and saying there was no need to bring warm clothes for a variety of reasons. That was sort of, in a sense, a minor skirmish. At about the same time I was testifying, something else was going on that it took me a couple more months to become aware of. And that is a school board in the state of Pennsylvania went a little bit further. And they decided to instruct the science teachers in Dover Area High School to prepare a curriculum on something called intelligent design, which is a relabeled form of creationism as an alternative to evolution. At the risk of losing their jobs, the teachers in that school district defied their Board of Education. They said, "We won't do it." So the Board of Education, I want you to think of a Board of Education doing this, actually wrote an intelligent design lesson of their own. They handed it to the teachers. They said, "Would you at least read it to the students?" And once again, they refused. So the school board sent the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, into the biology classes one day to basically read out this lesson and pass out books on intelligent design while the teachers literally stood outside in the hallway and absented themselves. Well, what happened the next morning was that 11 parents filed a First Amendment lawsuit arguing that this was an attempt to impose religion. 9 months later, the case went to trial, and in September 2005, the trial began. I was the lead witness on that trial as well. At this point, I had street cred, I guess, as a court witness. And it was covered extensively. This is actually the NBC TV courtroom sketch of me being cross-examined on, I can't remember, it was the first or second day of the trial. And I have to tell you something. I knew I would lead off in the morning on a Monday, and I figured I'd give my testimony in the morning. I'd be cross-examined in the afternoon, then I'd fly home, and I'd teach my Tuesday 1 p.m. cell biology class. Well, it didn't work out that way because my cross-examination went on for 9.5 hours. So I actually had to cancel classes the second day when I came back, and my colleague said, "What was that like?" 9.5 hours cross-examination by a very skillful attorney. And I said, "It's no problem at all. It was, you know, just like having the oral exam for your PhD over and over and over again." So away it went. And I wanted to give you some idea of what this extraordinary trial was like, because it went on for 7 full weeks, was extensively covered in the press. 4 books have been written about it, and 2 TV specials have been made, one by the BBC and one by Nova. I want to show you the teaser from the Nova show that'll give you some idea as to what was at stake.
On Nova.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
There's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turned, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of a science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day, intelligent design on trial on Nova.
Now, I hope that was dramatic enough for you. Here's how it went. That's sort of the end of the world narration style. This is an extraordinary program. You can watch it online if you want. It won the Peabody Award for broadcast journalism, and it's just an amazing story. Now, what I haven't told you is how the trial came out. By the end of the trial, anybody who had been there knew what was going to happen. But you've all seen trials on TV, and you know how the attorneys for the 2 sides get up and they make their closing statements in front of the judge. Well, the attorney for the school board got up, and he had one of those Dayminder calendar books with him. And he stood up in front of the judge, and he was thumbing through it. Nobody really knew what he was doing. And suddenly he looked up at the judge and said, "Your Honor, I'm not sure if the court is aware of this, but this trial has actually lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And the judge, a Republican appointed by George W. Bush, leaned down from the bench with a big smile on his face and said, "Yes, but it wasn't by design." At that point, we kind of had an idea of what was going to happen. The verdict came out just before Christmas in 2005. It was the lead story on the nightly news everywhere. The judge said this stuff is simply not science. And his opinion is extraordinary. I had friends of mine, because I roomed with law students when I was in grad school, I had friends of mine I hadn't heard from in years who read that opinion and said that's the clearest, the most cogent, and actually the funniest legal opinion they had ever read, because the judge came right out and said that the school board had acted, and these are the judge's words, with breathtaking inanity. And I had no idea that judges were allowed to say such things, but it was absolutely extraordinary. So that's sort of the beginning of it. And I would love to pretend that the opponents of evolution had their day in court. In fact, they had their 3 weeks in court. They got every witness they wanted to, and they still contradicted themselves, fell on their faces, and exposed their ideas as clearly not scientific at all. But nonetheless, this problem is still with us. What's happening in many legislatures around the country is that bills are being introduced basically to tamp down the teaching of evolution, to introduce alternative forms of knowledge, and we've all heard the idea of alternate facts coming in. There's an alternative facts bill in South Dakota that has actually got quite a few people in South Dakota worried about what this means for science education in the Trump era. And this is a subject of concern to me and actually to scientists and educators all over the country. This is going to go on. Now, what's driving this? A lot of things are driving it, one of which, of course, is religious fundamentalism. The gentleman you see here is an immigrant, I should point that out, an Australian immigrant named Ken Ham, who decided he would come to the United States and he would preach creationism. He established the largest anti-evolution organization in the country. It's called Answers in Genesis. They opened a creation museum in northern Kentucky about 10 years ago. It's an extraordinary place. I've been there. You got to see it, man. It is the quality of Universal Studios or Disney World, dedicated to misleading people about the natural history of the Earth. And that I find both impressive and very sad. More recently, he's opened what he called the Ark Park, which is a full-size, hand-built wooden replica of Noah's Ark. Haven't been there yet, but I'm dying to go. It's absolutely extraordinary. And the tactics involve fundraising, of course, but they also involve shaking down the taxpayers of the state of Kentucky, which I find absolutely extraordinary that Kentucky was willing to do this for what is in fact a religiously themed attraction. But this driving force of anti-evolutionism is still very much with us, as you heard when Provost Locke talked about the Pew Foundation study from 2015. So I think evolution matters. But it matters even more because it's sort of like the cutting edge of an anti-science movement in the United States. And you might think, there's really an anti-science movement in the United States? Yes, there is, and it's widely recognized internationally. This is an editorial from Nature from a few years ago, the leading scientific journal in the world, saying, in case you can't read it in the back, that the anti-science strain pervading the right wing in the US right now is the last thing America needs in a time of economic challenge, and I think that's absolutely true. So to document what I mean by science denial and anti-science movement, I figured I would go to the ultimate authority to show how broad this attack is, and it's that scholarly authority that I think most of us defer to when we need good source material, and of course that is The Daily Show. And I want to show you a clip that some of you may have seen, not about the current presidential campaign, that's a little bit too close and perhaps too raw for some of us, but the one 4 years ago. And again, I want to show you the point that The Daily Show made about that. Here we go.
Science claims it's working to cure disease, save the planet, and solve our greatest mysteries. But what's it really up to? From global warming?
I don't believe global warming is real.
To evolution?
Absolutely not, I don't believe in that.
To the HPV vaccine?
Her daughter suffered mental retardation as a result of that vaccine.
It seems science is up to something.
There are a substantial number of scientists who have manipulated data so that they will have dollars rolling into their projects.
Could these Republican candidates be right? Tonight, we answer the question, science, what's it up to?
Now this clip goes on for quite a while, and those of you who've seen it, you know how funny it gets with a visit to a science fair and all sorts of other things. But the reaction that many of us have in the scientific community, I think, is along the line of Andy Borowitz's reaction, which is, you can see his headline here. Or this one, and I love this on the anniversary of the moon landing. At some point, people believed in science in this country because they actually got themselves to the moon. But what I want to ask is not, why do the politicians that you just heard believe these things? Or I don't want to go the Borowitz route and say, how can you be so stupid? Rather, I want to ask a deeper question. And you might say I could frame it in terms of science in the age of Trump. But I actually mean something deeper than that. If you want to know what the difficulty is that is facing this particular political party, I think, for all of his own flaws on the subject, I think a Brown University graduate summed it up best. And some of you may remember this Brown University graduate. It's Governor Bobby Jindal saying, we Republicans have to stop being the stupid party. But what I want to talk about tonight is not who's being stupid. That's a trivial question. The more important question is, why is it that depicting yourself as anti-science has become a viable political strategy? Because every one of the people you have heard, I respect in terms of their political skills. That's the reason they were in the public square in the first place. And I also want to make something else clear, and that is, this is not going to be a diatribe against one particular political party. And there are lots of reasons for that. This is an article that in the New Republic very recently that some of you may have seen, making the case that on the liberal side of the spectrum, many people are just as reluctant to accept the findings of science as conservatives are. So this is a broader problem than saying in the political spectrum there's a smart side and a dumb side. That's naive and it's not realistic at all. So let me start out with a couple of specific examples. And this one in particular is from Canada, because anti-science doesn't occur just in this country, it occurs in other places as well. And this columnist is pointing out about a measles epidemic in the Toronto area, and it had help. And it had help from a local liberal, progressive, anti-vaccine movement of people who didn't want to get their kids vaccinated. And it turns out this anti-vaccine movement has led to outbreaks of several disorders, I shouldn't call them disorders, several diseases that we should have conquered and completely eliminated by now, including whooping cough, pertussis, and measles. And in fact, many of you remember there was a very large outbreak of measles that was centered, of all places, around Disneyland a couple of years ago, predominantly among the parents of kids who had not had them vaccinated for one reason or another. That same Pew Foundation report found something very interesting, and that is that in the last decade and a half, the number of Americans who think it's really important to get their kids vaccinated has dropped by 10%, and guess what? The number of measles cases in this country has gone up dramatically, and that's going to continue to be the case as long as we have so few parents recognizing that vaccinations are important. Now, why do people oppose vaccines? And you could say, well, they're wrong on this and they're just being stupid. There are, I think, deeper reasons. So I want to give you a couple of examples. One of them is my friend Rush Limbaugh. I used to make a habit when I had a few minutes of listening to Rush Limbaugh's radio program. And a few years ago, when we had an outbreak of a particular isotype of the flu, there was a nationwide vaccine effort, and Limbaugh resented that effort. And he resented it because he associated with the government. He was addressing here, this is an exact transcript, and I apologize for his language. He was talking about Kathleen Sebelius, a cabinet secretary at the time, and he started out in a charming way. Screw you, Ms. Sebelius. I'm not going to take the vaccine because you're telling me I must. It's not your role. It's not your responsibility. You do not have that power. I don't want to take your vaccine. I don't get flu shots. Now, when I heard that, my own feelings were mixed at the news that Mr. Limbaugh does not get a flu shot. But he saw this as a government effort which he opposed. Now, it turns out many of the other people who oppose vaccines oppose them for what you might call politically the opposite reasons, which is they associate them with big business pharmaceutical companies. They think companies are putting defective vaccines out there for no reason, that have very little use and put kids in danger just to make money. And if you doubt that, just do a little Google searching and you will find website after website telling you about this. And in fact, this extends to what we might call the progressive side of the political spectrum as well. RFK Jr., who's a well-known environmentalist and who has many, many political points of view with which I completely agree, stepped forward proudly to say that he would be glad to herald a committee established by President Trump to look into vaccine safety. And we all sort of know what look into vaccine safety means, which means basically to exercise these suspicions that vaccines are some sort of a capitalist plot being foisted upon us by big pharma. What are the facts? Come on, the facts are that vaccinations save lives. There was a supposed link between vaccines and autism. It was a fraud. It's the only study that's ever been published. It's been retracted by the journal that's published it, and the doctor who published it has been thoroughly discredited. And I want to show you something personal. I grew up I was a kid in the early 1950s, and we lived in a sort of semi-industrial suburban area of New Jersey, and there was a vacant lot with a stream running through it. We called it the Brook, and I and all the other kids around there, we used to love on a warm day, go down, play in the brook, build little dams, look at the little fish and stuff like that. And our parents in particular, our moms got really, really upset with us coming back with soaked pants and muddy sneakers and all sorts of other stuff. So my mom's ace card was to say, if you play in the brook, you will get polio. And that was really scary. There was nothing scarier that you could tell a kindergartner in 1953 than you might get polio. It was a terrifying disease. When the polio vaccine came out, I was in 3rd grade. I practically ran to the elementary school where the vaccinations were, rolled up my sleeve, and was delighted to have a needle stuck in my arm. Not because I was actually afraid of polio, but because I knew my mom could no longer tell me, you can't play in the brook because you're going to get polio. There were periodic episodes of polio in the United States right up to the point where the vaccine was introduced, and look at what happened since. And it's a similar story for other diseases for which we have vaccines. It's an extraordinary record of success. And for those of you who are young people and are not sure, well, what exactly is the seriousness of this? Again, do a Google image search for iron lung, and you will see exactly what I mean about the horror of polio for young kids. However, looking at this data, I am absolutely convinced that neither Limbaugh nor Kennedy, when they looked at this, would be convinced of vaccine safety and effectiveness. And why am I pretty sure that they wouldn't be convinced? That's because both of them are looking beyond the science itself to something else. And I want to explain what the something else is, but I want to do so by taking on another example of science denial, and that has to do with climate science. What you see here are land temperature records, northern and southern hemisphere, individual years and 5-year running averages put out by that noted left-wing organization, NASA. And what you can see as we go through is a very steady signal, especially in the northern hemisphere, but also in the southern hemisphere, of increasing global temperatures. The scene is very clear. And in fact, NASA put out that 2014 was the warmest year on record, but 2015 beat it, and 2016 has beat it again. We are now at the very end of the warmest decade ever recorded, and that's an absolute fact. And you can go onto any of the governmental websites and you will find this. Last year really was the hottest year ever recorded. It wasn't the hottest year everywhere, but we're talking about global climate and global averages. Now, I have actually confronted teachers who basically told me, oh, that's all nonsense, because global warming actually stopped in 2003. See how there's a plateau here? So it's leveling off and it's not happening anymore, and we don't have anything to worry about, so everything is cool. The only problem with that is that you can find these periodic pauses, if you want to call them that, almost anywhere you look in this record. So the real question is, what is happening now? And if you look at the latest data, this is what's happening now. These are those last 3 years. So the notion of some sort of a pause is absolutely bogus. But as someone who is trained, not as well as I would like to be in physical science, there's something that's always struck me about recordings like this of atmospheric temperatures. And that is, the atmosphere is the wrong place to look for an indicator of climate change. Even though we can see it very, very clearly. This is NOAA data from the Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Do you know where you should look for it? Well, let's do some basic physical science. The heat capacity of air is 0.3 of a calorie per degree Celsius. The heat capacity of water is 1,000 calories per degree Celsius. And again, if you don't speak scientific lingo, it means that to take a liter of water, basically you need 1,000 calories of heat to kick it up by 1 degree Celsius. So that's basically what a calorie is. That's how calorie heats. What this means is that water has 3,000 times the heat capacity of air. This planet is mostly water. So if it's really warming, we ought to stick a thermometer in the ocean and see what's going on there. So what is actually happening to the oceans? Well, it turns out every single organization in the world, there's a Japanese study, an American study, and an Australian study here, has shown a very, very clear signal of global climate change in the oceans. And in fact, I can go further. I can flood you with more data. I can tell you about glaciers. I can tell you about reductions in Arctic sea ice. And above all, for anybody living on the coast, I can tell you about sea level rise. People in New York City, people in North and South Carolina, people in Florida see this very, very clearly. All these indicators are here. So the question is, why doesn't this convince people? In fact, why do voters in many of the places that actually are affected by this very directly, why do they consistently support climate change deniers at the polls? So for example, we now have basically the chair of the House Science Committee being a climate change denier. We have the governor of Wisconsin, who was reelected, survived a recall petition, everything else. I think of Wisconsin as a very progressive state, but he keeps winning. He's actually ordered, and this was marked true, to remove all references to the word climate on the environmental websites of the state of Wisconsin, excuse me. So the question is why? What's going on? And if you look into the literature, or propaganda if you want to call it that, of climate change denial, some of it is shown here on the web, you're going to find something that I think is revealing. And that is, the literature of climate change denial doesn't just go after the science, it focuses on what it regards as the pro-government, pro-regulation motivations of scientists and public activists. So essentially, climate change denial comes out of an aversion to government interference with business in a lot of ways. And there are a lot of people who are not directly involved with profits from business who are nonetheless worried about that. So here's the insight that I would suggest to you, and that is deniers seek to protect the group with whom they identify, and that's private enterprise, employment, business, industry, from attack by what they regard as anti-business forces, collectivist forces. And that, in many respects, is at the root of climate change denial. You remember Mr. Limbaugh was against vaccines because he saw the government's hands in them. Other people were against vaccines because, on the other side of the spectrum, they saw the fingers of big business in them. And in each case, you have people looking past the science. Here's another example. Genetically modified organisms are routinely attacked by people who would identify as being on the political left. And they see them as tools of corporate agribusiness. And once again, go on the web, you'll see these awful, chilling images of what biotech companies are doing to our food and so forth. This is an opinion piece with which I completely agree. GMO opponents are the climate skeptics of the left, and I can go into that if you want. The notion that genetically modified organisms, GM crops, are dangerous is simply not true scientifically. And there are lots of ways to show that. We've been eating them for 30 years. And if there was anything dangerous about genetic modification of crop plants, we would have found it. And in fact, in the Pew Foundation study that Provost Locke cited, the single biggest gulf between the opinion of US adults and the opinion of scientists, a 51-point gap, came on the question of the safety of genetically modified food. And this is one in which scientists who know the data are not the least bit concerned about these. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that I've irritated some of you who would like to see GMOs labeled, who don't really want them in their food supply, and so forth. And what I want to say is that there are very legitimate issues regarding genetically modified organisms for food. Who owns the seed? Do they lead to the overuse of chemical herbicides? Do they promote the evolution of pest resistance? And these are important things to talk about. But the argument that these foods are dangerous absolutely has no scientific foundation. And I often tell my own students that I really wish that 30 years ago, when the first GMO foods appeared in the food supply, that the biotech industry had decided, you know what, we're going to label these. We're going to tell everybody why they're a good thing. They enable farmers to grow more food on less acreage. They mean the farmers don't have to use organophosphate pesticides, so they're more likely not to have residues that you don't want in the food. And we're going to charge you 10% more because these are such good products. Now, it turns out, finally, there is about to appear in the marketplace a labeled genetically modified organism because the genetic modification is going to be its selling point. And this is something called the Arctic apple. The Arctic apple does not turn brown, and therefore it stays fresher longer. Now, the only way to market this is not to pretend that it's a regular apple, but to pretend that it's a super-duper apple. And this is the sort of thing that I wish that Big Pharma had done in terms of genetically modified organisms. And in fact, as soon as I see it out there, I'm going to go ahead and buy these, pass them out to students in my class, see how they like them, and so forth. I hope it tastes better than the so-called Flavor Saver tomato, which was a dud. But the other thing about this is there's been an enormous change in bioengineering technology. And increasingly, we are going to see genetically modified organisms that don't have foreign genes added to them, but simply have their own genes tinkered with or inactivated. So there's nothing put into them, but rather genetic modifications are made by some new techniques in biotechnology. So again, this is a second point. Science denial even crops up in very liberal places like San Francisco. This is one of my favorite silly examples. At one point, the Board of Supervisors was so concerned about bogus anecdotal studies about cell phones causing brain cancer that they actually wanted they actually passed an ordinance to put a brain cancer warning on every single cell phone sold in San Francisco. I can just imagine the warning label right there on my iPhone. But there really was no scientific support for that action, and they kind of got over it. So what's the political point that I want to make here? The political point is that science is powerful, and science can be misused by people on the right and people on the left. And I think you will agree with me that there's a kind of tendency on the political left to impose regulations based on fears that are not supported by science. And GMOs are a good example. And I think vaccines are a good example. On the right, there's a tendency to oppose regulations that are based on facts, that are supported by science. And I would talk about pollution regulations, climate science, and so forth. So what you see playing out here are the political predispositions of right and left based on whether they like government activity or whether they don't, played out as a sort of an overlay on the scientific findings. And that, to me, is the heart of science denial. Now, the reflexive way that most of us in science want to overcome science denial is with a torrent of facts. Pardon me. And during the Kitzmiller trial that I talked about, we had 6 expert witnesses to present our case. They included, in sort of the mid-range, a theologian, a philosopher of science, a science education expert, and an expert in information theory. But we started our 6 experts with a scientist. I was the lead witness. And then we concluded, wrapped up, with the great Kevin Padian, who's a paleontologist from Cal Berkeley. And Kevin had the best line of the whole trial, which is at the very end of his testimony, our attorney asked him, Dr. Padian, why would you object to your children being told about intelligent design in biology class? And Kevin thought for a minute, and he broke into a big grin. He said, I oppose intelligent design because it teaches kids to be stupid. And what he meant by that is it tells you, don't ask any questions about what this adaptation is for, why these genes are arranged the way they are, why this structure does what it does. It was designed that way, end of story. It teaches kids to be incurious. And indeed, what Kevin and I did during the trial, because we were talking to a judge, was to sort of flood the judge with the facts supporting the theory of evolution, just one after another after another. And the judge, whom I've had contact with since, has said he was just overwhelmed by the integrity and the strength of the science on the side of evolution. But that doesn't always work in the public sphere, even though it worked in the environment of a trial. And in particular, very often, we run up against something that, quite frankly, has its roots in academia. This is our fault. And what I mean by our fault, I don't mean at Brown, but I mean in academia in general. There's a certain way of thinking that comes out of academia that would discount the very existence of objective fact in science. Paul Gross and Norman Levitt wrote a book about this, subtitled The Academic Left and Its Quarrels with Science. And the essential argument that you hear from time to time is that science is not a privileged way of knowing. It's not a search for objective truth. What science does, and this is sort of the sociological explanation, is science constructs explanations of nature to support a dominant social or economic group. The slogan that I heard a few times at various seminars was science exists to support the hegemony of the ruling classes. And therefore, one constructs one's own personal truth, which means, in effect, your fact is as good as mine, and what is lost is a common understanding of the nature of reality. Why is that a problem? It's a problem for a number of reasons. Here, for example, there's an article talking about Americans' increasing distrust of science, and not just climate change, all sorts of science, the science that I do and many other people in this room do as well. And there was a marvelous article about this written by Sean Otto in Scientific American a couple years ago called American Science Problem. You ought to look it up if you're interested. There's a great cartoon here, and I want to call your attention to the details of the cartoon. We have the icons of the Democratic and Republican Party sitting here, and what they are doing is sweeping symbols of science under the rug, like they want to get them out of the way, while the portrait of Thomas Jefferson looks down disapprovingly from the wall. What are you doing to science? And what Otto pointed out was that science denialism among Democrats, false belief vaccines cause autism, Republican science denialism falsely denies climate change and evolutionary biology. These are points I've already made. Why is this dangerous? It's dangerous for this very simple reason that Otto pointed out. When facts become opinions, the collective policy-making process of a democracy breaks down, because gone is the common denominator, knowledge, that can bring opposing sides together. We see this today, not just in science, but even in things like the number of people who attended the inauguration. I mean, it's just an extraordinary thing to see alternative facts presented. But certainly, when this happens in science, it's a genuine and an absolute tragedy. Now, what do we do about this? Again, do you flood people with facts? Well, by and large, that doesn't work. This is an article from the New York Times not too long ago, pointing out the work of Dan Kahan, who is a psychologist who also teaches at Yale University Law School. And he wrote, or this is a summary of his work, that more information is probably not the key to winning public acceptance. It may actually harden anti-science views. There are studies that show that when people are presented with contrary opinions, they actually harden their position against those contrary opinions. So how do you do this? And this is a paper that you can find online by Dan Kahan, and he studied extensively communication on climate science and what it takes to change somebody's mind. And he says to get beyond debates over science itself, he looks for the roots of those. And that's what I've been trying to do when I ask, why do certain people oppose this or that or the other thing? And he points out that he thinks the problem is something he calls cultural cognition. And that is an unwillingness to identify culturally with the scientific community. And the way he writes it is this, and this is from his paper. Telling people 97% of scientists agree doesn't diminish polarization, makes it worse by amplifying the association between competing identities and competing positions. This is what the scientists believe. Well, I'm not a scientist, and I have different interests from them. What needs to be changed, and I agree with this completely, are the circumstances that make recognizing scientific information hostile to the identity of reasoning citizens. Now, how can you do that? And I love this line. Can you do it? Sure. Ask a good high school teacher to show you how. Because in a sense, this is what the educators of young people are involved in, and that is getting them to identify with the scientific community, with the literary community, with the artistic community. This is the very job of education itself. And therefore, winning people over to science isn't so much a matter of facts, it's really a matter of identity. Now, I want to show you something. How do you win people over to evolution in terms of identity? That is an image that I have found very useful in terms of winning over religious groups to the idea that science doesn't threaten religion. We have a pope right now in Rome who said not too long ago that, of course, evolution and the Big Bang are real. Why is that? Well, this pope was originally trained as a chemist, which some of you may know. He's a Jesuit, which is historically the group within the church that has been the most science-friendly. And if any of you read his encyclical on the ecology and the earth, which I urge to all of you, it will be very obvious that this encyclical was actually written by somebody who knows what an infrared absorption spectrum is, which is a very unusual thing to say about a theologian. But he appreciated the depth of it, and he was extraordinarily successful in making that argument. Now, I grew up, as I mentioned before, in the 1950s. The high school I attended is now in the lowest quarter of academically performing high schools in that state, and when I went to school there, it was probably there too. Nonetheless, I always felt like I got a tremendous science education, and I want to show you who I owed that great education to in that underperforming public schools. Anybody know what that means? I owed my science education, God bless them, to the commies. And the reason for that, young people pay attention to this, in 1957, the Soviets beat us into space with the first Earth satellite. That was Sputnik 1. The shock waves in this country that reverberated on this were unbelievable. People were terrified that our kids were behind in math and science. I remember reading articles, why does Ivan know science and Johnny doesn't, in terms of what's going on. So what happened was new textbooks, new curriculum, new lab equipment just flooded into schools. Some of it was government, some of it was private. The grimy town in which I grew up was the headquarters of the Merck Pharmaceutical Company. They took our schools under their wing. They brought us new physics stuff. They brought us new chemistry stuff. It was sensational. I also think I benefited from the culture of the 1950s. I watched a lot of TV as a kid. Now, for those of you who unfortunately were born too recently, I want to tell you who this gentleman is. This is an actor whose name was Don Herbert. Every Saturday morning where I lived, he was on TV in a program called Mr. Wizard. Let me explain to you the premise of the program. Mr. Wizard is a single man living alone in the neighborhood. Every Saturday morning, he invites 2 or 3 children, unescorted, to come into his house, to do experiments Nobody thought that was strange. It was a more innocent age. But the cool thing about Mr. Wizard is just about everything he did when the show was over, I could go into the kitchen or the garage or the workbench in the basement and I could reproduce those experiments for myself. He gave a whole generation of scientists, talk to anybody my age, he gave a whole generation of scientists the confidence that they could do science, that this wasn't something you needed advanced degrees and fancy equipment to do, that science was cool and you can do it. I also think I benefited from the sort of the culture of amateurism. I used to go to toy stores and lust after the science kits that were for sale in those. So I went back on the internet to get some pictures of like chemistry sets and stuff, and quite unintentionally I discovered a sociological change. All the chemistry sets and science kits from the 50s only show boys. And I thought, wow, that is really, really different. And I have two daughters, one of whom is a scientist, and therefore that struck me very strongly. But again, the notion that you can do science yourself was powerful. And just in case you think I'm kidding you about the personal influence this had on my life, this is a picture of me on my 11th birthday in the basement of my house in New Jersey. And this is my first laboratory, and that is my first microscope. And if you watch the NOVA clip, you'll know that I sit in front of a much larger microscope now. But that was sort of the beginning. And I sort of grew up in this culture that science was like the coolest thing you can do. I didn't think it was political. I didn't think it was liberal or conservative. I just thought it was neat. Now, in the 1950s, I think it's fair to say we might have over-romanticized science. There were wonderful science programs on TV. I thought I was going to be a nuclear physicist when I read Walt Disney book Our Friend the Atom, but then I picked up Microbe Hunters by Paul de Kruif, and from that point on, I wanted to be a biologist. If you've never read this book, Microbe Hunters, it's kind of romantic and it's kind of corny, but it will make you want to be a research biologist, trust me. But if we romanticize science then, I think today we sort of politicize it and demonize it. And that's the problem. There has been a cultural shift in what we think about science, the scientific enterprise, and scientists. So how does science reclaim its innocence? And by innocence, I mean the notion that science really is a search for truth in an almost, in a very compelling way. Now, I don't know if what I'm going to show you is the answer, but I do know I'm going to reveal the lowbrow nature of my own taste in entertainment by showing you my favorite TV show. And there it is. It's Big Bang Theory. And I have to tell you, this is a ridiculous show. And for all the sexual innuendo and all the nonsense that goes on there, what I absolutely love about the show, and it now has some very strong female characters who are also scientists, what I love about the show is the absolute purity of their interest in science, whether it's string theory, whether it's the structure of the nervous system, whether it's drug discovery, just about everything. And I'm absolutely convinced that this show has begun to give science a more positive image in our culture. And I'd like to see more of it because cultural connections to science matter. And I think they matter a great deal. And I also think that the scientific establishment, of course of which I'm part, has to change its approach. And by that I mean organizations of scientists and educators. And I'll give you one glaring example of that. This man was the most effective communicator of science that I have ever seen in my lifetime. This is the late Carl Sagan. I should tell you something. I mentioned that low-performing high school in New Jersey where I went. Carl Sagan went to the same high school. He even took my aunt to his senior prom. It didn't last, though. I wasn't planning on saying this, but at one point, I was about to debate a creationist, and I needed some astronomical data, and I talked to the people I knew at Harvard Smithsonian. They couldn't answer. I spoke to a few people at Brown. They didn't know, and I figured in desperation, I'm going to write a letter to Carl Sagan, who was then at Cornell, and I asked them the question, and I said, by the way, I believe you know my aunt, Doris Hamill. He's blah, 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 and so forth and so on. What I didn't know at the time was that Dr. Sagan was at that point between wives number 2 and number 3. And he wrote back 2 days later, and the first line in the letter was, how is Doris anyway? But Carl Sagan had the incredibly successful Cosmos series on TV. It won a Peabody, an Emmy, many other awards. It shaped the public perception of science. But within the scientific community, Sagan was kind of looked down on. He was denied tenure at Harvard. He was denied membership of the National Academy. A lot of his colleagues were jealous of him. A lot of them basically said, He's more recognized by Hollywood than science. That was a terrible mistake. He was the best promoter we ever had in science. Well, we now have a new Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he is sensational. I can't get enough of this guy. I want to see him on TV more and more precisely because of this, and I'm very happy to say that Dr. Tyson has been widely honored and recognized by the scientific community, so I think the scientific community is beginning to learn its lesson in that respect. Now, what can a university do? This is after all, a series about reaffirming university values. And when I look at the titles of the other talk in the series, the one I'm giving tonight stands out a little bit differently because it hasn't concerned yet what we should do and how we should conduct ourselves within the halls of a university. So I'm going to make a couple general suggestions that tie into what I'm talking about. One is a university can embrace the open intellectual culture under which science thrives. There are many societies in many countries around the world which over the years have tried to push science in a particular direction, to stifle certain areas of science with which they were not comfortable, and in every single case without exception, it has not worked out. The greatest example of that was Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, where it became, under Stalin, the official policy of the Soviet Union, believe it or not, to persecute Mendelian genetics because it was considered to be a threat to the idea of the new socialist man. The result was the Soviet Union lost at least one and probably two generations of biologists. They produced very good physical science, but nothing in the life sciences. And that's what happens when you try to stifle intellectual curiosity in science. The rest of the university should think about that in terms of attempts to basically channel intellectual curiosity, not just in science, but in history, in economics, and political science as well. Of all universities, Brown, with its tradition, should be the most open. And I think that's the lesson this university can take from science. And secondly, and this is going to sound a little strange, there is an attitude that I often see among our students, and I see very often among our colleagues, that science is kind of like how-to stuff. If I'm going to go to med school, yes, I have to learn biology and chemistry. If I'm going to build buildings and bridges or design computer systems, I have to learn engineering, I have to learn computer science. But if I'm going into law, if I'm going into business, I don't need that. I can hire a scientist who knows the technology to do these things for me. That's a terrible mistake. Science is a liberal art. And what I mean by that is, think of the horror, and I mean this in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way. Think of the horror of science and engineering majors who have never taken a course in literature, who don't know the plays of Shakespeare, who cannot appreciate music, who don't understand the difference between Impressionism and Cubism and so forth. How terrible that would be. But think also of how many of our students major in the humanities and the social sciences and couldn't tell you what the second law of thermodynamics was, or couldn't tell you what the bases were in DNA. Science is a liberal art. It forms part of our culture. And to be ignorant of science is as profound an intellectual gap as to be ignorant of the literature or the history of our country and its people. And what I mean by that is science has done extraordinary things, even very recently, in expanding our understanding of who we are and where we are. This is part of the wide field image from the Hubble Space Telescope, showing not stars, but galaxies. And every galaxy contains on the order of 100 billion stars. The vastness of the universe that we know through modern science is just absolutely amazing. You can go down to the very small. This is an image from my own laboratory showing photosynthetic reaction centers as individual particles tucked into biological membranes. Is this important to you? Probably, because this is why you can breathe. This is where oxygen is produced on this planet, within the mechanism of these little structures. Up here we see a cell in the process of cell division. There's extraordinary beauty within biology, just as there is within astronomy and chemistry and earth science and everything else. And to me, and maybe I'm partial, because I happen to be married to a RISD alum, all of this is a kind of art that ties into an artistic conception of the unity of knowledge. There's a wonderful saying that's part theological and part philosophical, that all knowledge is one. And I believe that with all my heart, and I certainly believe that science is part of that. What is the beauty of science? The beauty of science includes, for example, this tiny little graph, which you see here, which is the recording of the very first gravity waves ever recorded from the collision of two black holes many millions of years ago, finally getting to Earth and confirming an essential part of Einstein's theory of general relativity. How do I feel about all this stuff? How do I feel about the issue of science denial? I think there is something in the psychology of people who go into science, into experimental science, that makes them by nature optimists. If you were not an optimist, if you did not believe that knowledge was better than ignorance, that your own efforts and your efforts of your colleagues could not advance the cause of human knowledge, why would you do research? Why would you compete for support? Why would you propose controversial theories and then test them, often proving that you yourself are wrong, which is something that an experience that almost every scientist has had. And I think ultimately the mission that I feel as a scientist and as an educator is very simple, and that is to sort of convey a sense of something. And I want to tell you a very brief story that I've told many times, and that is one of the things I love about Brown is that I actually know people in other departments. That doesn't seem surprising to anyone in this room. I made that remark once to a lecture at Ohio State University, and the crowd was amazed because the size of the university there makes it very difficult to actually know people in other departments. But at Brown, that's definitely not the case. And not too long after I came back here as a faculty member, my wife and I had a number of people over for dinner. She had her old illustration professor at RISD over for dinner, another painting professor. I had a couple of colleagues in other areas, and we had a nice dinner, and we probably drank too much wine, and at the end of it, everybody started some really silly conversations. And the silliest of them was, if you could live at any time in history, what would be your favorite time to live? And someone who was philosophically inclined said, well, I'm interested in philosophy, but I think since Plato and Aristotle, philosophy has gone straight downhill, so I would have liked to live in Athens during the period of the academy and talk to those people and been in on those debates. Another person, actually my daughter, who even then knew she wanted to be a teacher of history, said she would have liked to have lived right after the American Revolution and talk to people, see what it's like. My wife and one of the RISD professors said, are you kidding me, man? Paris, 1870s, birth of the Impressionist movement, most interesting time in the history of art, blah, blah, blah. This went on for a while, and finally somebody turned to me and said, there's a couple of you in science in this room, and none of you have said anything. So I looked at one of my new colleagues, and she looked back at me, and we both smiled, we broke into laughter, because we knew the answer, which is that for a scientist, the most interesting time in human history to be alive is right now. And I am absolutely convinced that the key to winning acceptance for science in the political and economic sphere, and acceptance in science among our own students within this university and within higher education throughout this country and throughout the world, is to let people know this is the most exciting time in the history of science, and all of us, whether we are professional scientists or not, are and can be part of it. Thanks a lot. Take questions? I know there are a couple microphones, and I'd be real happy to take questions.
And we can bring them.
Right here.
So one of the points you make, I don't know if this works, but it does, okay.
Yeah, it's working fine.
One of the points you make is that high school teachers can be the best advocates for, or the best people for helping students identify as scientists. So what do you think happens between the time when someone takes a high school science course and identifies as a scientist, and then later is a denier of science? So what happens in that time? Why does a person stop identifying as a scientist?
Well, I wish I could answer on the basis of careful longitudinal psychological studies, which is what that answer would require, which is to test people or to interview people all the way through. So all I can tell you is what I think. and that is that I think that science has become so important in our society. I mean, it's just remarkable how many issues confront society right now in terms of energy use, land use, healthcare policy, and so forth. How many of these issues that have a scientific component? And I think very often people, again, look past the science, and that's sort of the thesis that I'm driving tonight, and look towards their own personal economic interest, their own religious points of view. And I see this all the time when I argue about evolution, that people are so tightly wedded to their religious beliefs that I realize I have to approach them from a religious point of view to sort of explaining why evolution is indeed compatible with religion. In fact, well, I can go into the details of that. But I think basically all of us have different interests in society. No one can pretend that they are without biases. I certainly would not pretend that about myself. And I think ultimately, and let's take climate change as a very, very good example. One of the points that I try to make, and my co-author, Joe Levine, has made this point in talk after talk in many essays, is that accepting the reality of climate change and the fact that human activity is the driver of that change doesn't automatically say what the political and economic solution should be. And I hear from so many people who deny climate change saying, well, I don't want to pay a carbon tax. I don't want the government to close the coal mines and put those people in West Virginia out of work. All of these are policy decisions, however. The science is still there. So the point is that I think very often when people become science deniers, they become deniers because they see either their own economic interests threatened or, as Dan Kahan would say, they see their group identification threatened. Taking evolution, if you belong to a religious group, and I'm not just talking about doctrine, I'm talking about people you see every Wednesday night for Bible study and you see every Sunday in church, who teach your own children Sunday school and so forth. To take an opinion that would break you socially and culturally out of that group takes tremendous courage. And I think ultimately that's what the problem is. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that great talk.
Thank you.
I am in charge of hospital care at Hasbro Children's Hospital, and we see victims of vaccine deniers all the time. Not 2 weeks ago, I had a child with pneumonia whose parents declined the pneumococcal vaccine. The question I have relates to one of the slides you had up there, which was referencing an article by Brendan Nyan, and he's a political professor up at Dartmouth. And he made an interesting point in a study in pediatrics where he showed that vaccine deniers were less likely to listen to the advice of a pediatrician, but more likely to listen to advice of someone who they considered to be at their level of society, a colleague or a friend.
Up here. Yeah.
Up here,
Yeah.
exactly. Who in the community is going to espouse the benefits of science if it shouldn't be scientists? Who's going to be out in the United States saying science is important who's not a scientist?
Well, that's a good question. I think people like you, physicians, are on the front line of this sort of thing, and in fact, having frank conversations between doctor and patient, I think, is very important, particularly among pediatricians. And I think very often that first contact of a parent with a young child and a pediatrician is absolutely essential in terms of building a relationship between the healthcare profession and the individual. The other thing, the other thing to recognize is that vaccines are indeed making a new vaccine for a disease, getting it tested, getting it through stage 1 trials, stage 2 trials, everything else is enormously complicated, takes an enormous amount of money. It's not going to be done by a mom and pop startup, it's going to be done by big pharmaceutical companies. Big pharmaceutical companies in the United States have not covered themselves with glory in terms of standing out as paragons of public interest. You see behavior after behavior of what an economist would call rent seeking, which is buying an asset like a generic drug and then jacking up the price. And this sort of behavior, which you might say is straightforward capitalism, this behavior, I think, reflects badly on the entire industry, and vaccines are part of that industry. So I don't know how to make pharmaceutical companies behave better, but one of the things that I can tell you is that their own behavior in terms of seeking higher and higher levels of reimbursement for drugs over which they have done absolutely no research basically has spread discredit on the whole industry. And I think that's part and parcel of one of the reasons why people distrust vaccinations, among other things. So I think ultimately the duty to speak up for science is the duty of everybody in the society, and certainly those people who appreciate the importance of vaccination. I mean, I gave you that little tongue-in-cheek thing about the polio vaccine. Everything I just said, by the way, with the Brook and the getting the vaccine, that was all absolutely true in terms of that extraordinary thing. And I think also because vaccination has been so successful in eliminating diseases like diphtheria, like pertussis, like smallpox, like measles, like mumps, people think they're not there anymore. And the reality is, as you know, they are indeed out there. And again, the terror of a summertime polio epidemic was just I mean, I can tell you a story about my wife. She was about 2 years old. She grew up in very rural northwestern Pennsylvania. There was a family wedding. Family's largely Italian. So they were having a good old time, having a little party. Everybody's there on the dance floor. Cute little 2-year-old Jody is in a nice dress, and everybody says how cute she is. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the scene, Jody falls down on the floor and cannot get up. The only thing, and my mother-in-law and father-in-law told me about this almost with tears in their eyes, the only thing that anybody could think about was polio. She's going to be crippled. Oh my God. So they rushed her home. They called the town doctor who came over. The town doctor, with a very grave face, came in suspecting the worst. Then he got down really close, smelled her breath, and said, "This child is drunk." But that tells you how fearful people were of these diseases, and that fear has largely gone. And I think that's one of the reasons why people can be so cavalier about vaccine regimens.
Yeah. You stated that you grew up with Mr. Magician and I think my generation kind of grew up with
Mr. Wizard.
Mr. Wizard, that's it. My generation kind of grew up with Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's actually creating a show on Netflix and coming back to kind of talk about science and the denials and what is actually out there. Do you think that show is something that is going to positively impact the view of science by society?
Oh, yeah.
Or is it too political?
Yeah, I love Bill Nye. I think he does wonderful work. I'd like to see more of him on TV. Same with Neil deGrasse Tyson and several other people who are really good popularizers of science. But one of the problems, you say he's going to be on Netflix, right? Yeah, well, I don't get Netflix, okay? I'll find a way to see him. But here's the thing. Don Herbert, Mr. Wizard, I forget which network he was on, but he was on network in the days when there were exactly 3 TV channels. So even if you were moderately successful, you had an audience of 30 million. Today, it's the Super Bowl that draws that many people. So the fact of the matter is, it's great to have him on. The Cosmos series by Carl Sagan was watched by 10 times as many people as saw Neil deGrasse Tyson's series. And it's not the fault of Dr. Tyson. It's the explosion of alternate media channels that we had. So he does good work, and I'm glad he's going to be there. But you know, increasingly, anything you do on any mainstream media is you're just reaching a tiny slice of the public, and that's part of the problem.
You want me to go ahead and pick? I have 4 people.
Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Hello, I loved your talk.
Oh,
I actually had a 2-part question. One was just like at the very beginning, we heard how 96% of scientists agree on whatever. And I was wondering if, as scientists, we are so hesitant to just unequivocally say this is true, because we know as scientists that we've been proved wrong, that our hesitation sort of gives the wrong impression to the public. And also, is there something wrong in the way we are teaching science, that people don't understand the process and the rigor of getting even a single tiny finding out, that they're so easily able to point fingers at decades of research and say that's wrong?
Well, it's a 2-part question. So first part is, yes, very often in science we understand that all science is tentative. Nothing in science is ever proven in the mathematical sense. So everything is subject to disproof, to revision, and we can all think of a whole series of ideas that we once thought were true that have turned out to be wrong. There were a lot in the textbooks that I studied in high school and college that I now know are incorrect. When I go into high schools that are using my own high school biology textbook, I tell the students, I'm going to tell you something that you might find disturbing, but I actually think you should find exhilarating. And that is, at least 10% of the stuff in this book is wrong, but I don't know which 10% it is. And that's the thing for your generation to figure out, and that's also what makes science exciting. But I think very often, in the tentative nature of the conclusions that we can make, we lose sight of the fact, which is, well, a fact, which is that science, while it doesn't prove things, we can disprove things. And very often, there are suppositions and ideas that are out there that are just plain wrong. And the idea that vaccines are associated with autism is exactly such an idea. There's been study after study after study, and there's never been a correlation. And that idea is simply wrong. It's just absolutely not out there. Oh my goodness, I ran it on the first part. What was the second part?
About just not knowing how rigorous science is, and so easily being to question scientists.
Well, human beings should question scientists. I think that's very important. With respect to science denial, it's foolish and naive to think that one should ever go in front of an audience in a general or a specific way and say, here are all my degrees, you should believe what I say, now get out there and toe the line. That's not how we work, and that is certainly not effective in terms of general public discourse. And again, I think ultimately what you have to do is you have to appeal to people through their own cultural value system in order to get them to understand why science is compatible with that cultural system and with those values.
Thank you for the talk. What I'm curious about is in this kind of new age of alternative facts and echo chambers is how do we as part of the scientific community get out of our own echo chamber and really get out there and talk to people? Because I think, especially here on Brown, it's such an open campus, it's very easy to stay in your own chamber unintentionally.
Well, all of us leave this chamber either when we graduate, take a job, go somewhere else, or in my case, in the case of some of my colleagues here, we go home from work. So I think the most important thing that's incumbent on all of us is to be active citizens, to participate in the community. You're a graduate student. You have absolutely no idea how influential you would be if at some point you walked into a school board meeting during the public comment period and you said, I am a PhD student in pathobiology. Every head in the room would turn. The respect you would command would be absolutely astonishing. And I think all too often, those of us who are in science or science education are reluctant to go out in the community as ordinary citizens and communicate science in ordinary language to people. Scientists are notoriously bad at doing ordinary communication. I am seriously addicted to listening to Science Friday on NPR every Friday afternoon. I never miss it. And I know Ira Flatow. I've actually been on Science Friday a couple times. I think it's a great show. But I'd say every other guest that Ira Flatow has on that show, Ira has to labor to get a plain English sentence out of them saying what they are actually doing. And that reflects how poor we are very often at scientific communication. There's a friend of mine named Randy Olson who spoke here at Brown not too long ago, who's done a couple of really hilarious movies, one on intelligent design, one on climate change. Randy was a tenured professor of ecological science at the University of New Hampshire. He decided he wanted to get into science communication. No kidding. He went out to California. He took stand-up comedy lessons. He did improv. He became quite an accomplished comedian. Then he produced these movies which are highly successful and won awards. And he's written a book called Don't Be Such a Scientist. And it's a book on how scientists can communicate. So I would urge you, get out there in the real world, talk to real people. I'd like to tell people, actually I don't because it's kind of secret. I have a secret career in the springtime and the summer as a sports official. I mentioned softball earlier on. I graduated from that, became an umpire, and I now umpire NCAA fast pitch softball all the way up to D1. And in the summer I work youth tournaments. It will not surprise you that very few of my fellow sports officials are academics. Mostly they're school teachers, they're plumbers, they're people in construction, they're all sorts of stuff. And scientific topics come up. And I don't pull rank on them and say, hey, I'm a professor at where. I just, I talk to them about science and I try to represent science in a very common sense way. And I think that's something we can all do. Okay.
Ken, great talk.
David, thank you.
My question is really just a follow-up to that, is how do we here at the university train our students or teach our students or engage our students to be scientists, but to go into the public domain and I think the fastest way to affect this science literacy is to have scientists to become politicians. There was an interesting article in the New York Times, and Mike Eisen, who's an evolutionary geneticist, is thinking of running for the Senate because he's so upset about the way the world is going. And his policy will be liberty, equality, reality. I think is his
oh boy!
It's the French liberté.
Oh boy, do I love that. That's great.
So what can we do as faculty members to? And there's often this divide between, you're going to be really good at science or really good at political science, and those are big divides. What can we do to teach our students, or not teach is the wrong word, to excite our students to go in this direction so that they can actually not just be great communicators with science, but great effectors of scientific change?
Well, I think I wish I had a perfect answer for that, but my short answer is basically to keep reminding everybody that we live, for all its failings, in a democratic society where the health and vitality of the scientific enterprise depends upon public support. And it depends upon public support in many different ways. And when you talk to science students, you have to help them to appreciate that the very fact that you are there in the classroom, that you have support for your research, that you're able to bring these research findings to them, to welcome them into your laboratory, to independent study, and all that sort of. All of these are consequences that flow from public support for science. And if we lose public support for the scientific enterprise in this country, none of that's going to happen. And I think that's why it's important to make everyone a citizen advocate for science.
So we have one here, and there's one there, and then maybe one last one. So
Oh boy, this is getting to be like a department. Yeah, this is looking like a departmental meeting so far. Professor Wessel, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Fear. How much of denial may be associated with fear? Fear that the earth is going in the wrong direction, fear that my religion is fragile, fear of the next disease, fear that I don't understand this stuff, and therefore I'm just not going to believe it.
I think fear is one of the strongest motivators that we have. I think fear motivates more profoundly than love does. And when I speak, for example, to Christian audiences about the theory of evolution, which I'm going to do at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama in about 2 weeks, I know that in the faces of many of the people in the audience, I will see a fear that if they believe the things I am telling them, they are in danger of losing their immortal souls. That's a terrifying prospect. And you basically have to approach these people, as I've tried to emphasize, in a way that is appropriate to their culture. And what I tell Christian audiences is very straightforward, and that is that the first duty of any Christian is to the truth. No theologian would dispute that. So therefore, your first question about evolution ought not to be, is it consistent with the book of Genesis? Does it fit with Paul's references to Adam in the letters of Paul and so forth? Your first question about evolution ought to be, is it true? And the answer to that is yes. And from that, all else should follow. And if you really want to, I can quote St. Augustine, writing at the beginning of the 5th century, basically saying why Christians have a duty to follow empirical truth. The fact that I'm a Christian myself helps me make those arguments with some conviction, but the fact of the matter is that basically the way you appeal to people is by understanding their own value system and by placing science and other arguments within the context of that value system. And I think that is the way to overcome fear.
So, Ken,
hi, Rich.
So as someone who took your cell biology class 25 years ago.
Oh, man.
And TA'd Bio 20 for you a couple years after that.
You're making us both feel old,
yeah.
man. I mean, come on.
And who now teaches the vaccine science course here at
Indeed.
Brown, which was founded by my PhD mentor, Paul Knopf, who we just lost. I spent a lot of time thinking about vaccine rejection. And so this thing going on in politics right now, I recognize it because I've been seeing it in that sphere for a very long time. And what worries me sometimes is the issue of false equivalency, especially when I see topics that are relevant to science being covered in media. And I'm not trying to harsh on the media. There's enough of that happening right now. But I just worry that sometimes the training that, let's say, journalists have, the very, proper training, they tend to want to look at both sides of a story. But at what point do we, when it comes to science, do we have to say to them, no, this is not valid. There aren't really 2 points to this issue anymore, or there never were. It's just not valid to present it as if there is a debate. What do we do?
Yeah, first of all, you're absolutely right about that, and that is journalists are taught to find two sides to every story so that they can be neutral and can be not accused of journalistic bias or something like that. I'll tell you one of the best lines I ever heard. I think it was in the year 2002. The Board of Education, the elected Board of Education of the state of Ohio, was approving, or perhaps disapproving, a series of lessons in laboratories for their biology curriculum, K through 12. And they were thinking about incorporating a series of 12 lessons on intelligent design. This is prior to the Kitzmiller trial, okay? So this became so controversial that they decided they would have a public debate in front of the Board of Education at a big auditorium in Columbus, so the board's sitting in front, and no kidding, there's like 1,200 people back there. They invited two people to speak for science, myself and the astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss, who's now at Arizona State. Lawrence is a very well-known author. If there's any Star Trek fans in here, Lawrence wrote The Physics of Star Trek, which is just a great book. Okay. Then there were two people from the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, pushing the pseudoscience of intelligent design. So we're going back and forth, and I'm focusing on data, and I'm showing slides, I'm talking about fossils, I'm talking about DNA sequences, doing the things I do. Lawrence gets up, and he had the best line. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, there are two people from the Discovery Institute over there, and there are two scientists over here. That's not quite right. There should be one person from the Discovery Institute over there and 10,000 scientists on this side." And trying to get that across in a journalistic context is difficult. But nonetheless, it can be done. And in fact, the first time I was on Science Friday, I was asked to do a point-counterpoint with Michael Behe of Lehigh University, who's really the only credentialed scientist at a university pushing intelligent design. And it was like a little debate. Michael's a nice guy, so we weren't name-calling, we were going back and forth. The second time that Ira called me up and wanted me on to talk about evolution, I thought, who else you going to have on? And Ira said, we're not doing that anymore. Those guys are wrong. We're simply going to have regular scientists on, and that's what we're going to talk about. So I think that's an important thing to get across. For journalists who are not trained in science, this is a very, very difficult thing. The other thing that's difficult is there used to be, every large newspaper used to have a science writer. The Providence Journal had a guy named Eugene Emery, a very good science writer. Gene still works for the paper, but he's like a part-timer freelancer who now is consigned to write about high school graduations and the occasional sporting event. So he's no longer a regular science columnist. The New York Times even the Washington Post doesn't have a regular science correspondent anymore, which is tragic. I'm affiliated with the NewsHour on PBS. It has a full-time science reporter. And does a wonderful job, but again, that's just a small sliver of the viewership. So I think you have to find ways to get across to journalists that in science, all ideas are not created equal. And in fact, what science is involved in is considering alternative ideas and rejecting the ones that are wrong. And it's important to us to let people know why these wrong ideas have been rejected, but the fact is that we're certainly sure that they're wrong, and we shouldn't be equivocal about that. So, good point, Rich.
Here's the last question.
Okay.
Is it on? Okay.
You're on.
Having participated in the Women's March in Boston, I know
my daughters did too, and it was a little crowded, they said,
but it was
they loved it.
A lot of fun and very therapeutic. And my husband and I are getting excited about the Science March, and I've been reading some commentary where, of course, scientists want to debate about, should we do this, should we not do this, is this just going to create a lot of anger towards us, are we sticking our necks out in a way that, this isn't a political idea, this is just the truth. Is it dangerous to go out there and, with our banners and our anger and show that we really want to change the world? Is that a bad idea, and is that just going to create wrath? Or is it a great idea because if we say nothing, we're not going to get any attention?
Okay.
I'm just curious what your opinion is.
Yeah, I'm going to equivocate on this, and I'll explain to you what I mean. Yeah. First of all, I'm really into sticking my neck out, okay? I'm cool with that. I have a whole file of hostile emails and letters and so forth based on court appearances, TV appearances, stuff like that. I've been on a lot of radio talk shows. As soon as a talk show host says, this guy's going to talk about evolution, switchboard lights up. People want to come in. They want to argue. This is something that everybody has an opinion about. Okay. So I think scientists should stick their necks out. We should make our voices known. There's a danger inherent in this. And the danger is that we in science do not want to be seen as promoting or opposing a particular political party. There is danger in science associating itself, to be very specific, with the Democratic Party or with the progressive, and I say that as a Democrat and as a political progressive. If there is a march of scientists, and I think it's supposed to be on Earth Day, April 22nd, it would be dangerous to make it an anti-Trump march. As much as many of us in the scientific community don't like the current president. To say that scientists have this particular political point of view might even further politicize science. If the march can be handled in such a way that there's a positive message, and the positive message is we are scientists, we are doing great things for this economy, great things for public health, great things for the environment, great things for everybody here. We want people to know that, and we petition the government to continue, and the people to continue to support us to do that, then I think this can work out. But I really think there is a political trap here that has to be avoided. And that's one of the reasons why I showed that New Republic article saying, think the Democrats are the party of science? Not exactly. There is no political party that is precisely aligned with science. And I think if we can do it and preserve scientific integrity, then by all means we should. Okay, thanks. And thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.